This time on Backshed, the Stato's back. We put a full exhaust on her, bit of cool on her, she's back on the road. But she took some convincing. Let's take a look. If you haven't seen the previous episode on the Statesman, she's a 1984 WB DeVille 2 5 litre. When we first got the Statesman, she'd been parked for years. She'd had mechanical bits missing, she was disassembled inside. We got her running and driving in the last episode, but in this episode we're going to put a full exhaust on her, a few other little bits and pieces, and we're going to get some reg on her and put her back on the road. So I've got a little list of things I want to do for this thing before it goes for rego. We've got a full exhaust on it, and if you remember from the previous video, there's some pretty expert bush hackery under this thing, so we're going to get rid of that. We've also got a wiper and indicator switch on the column that needs to be replaced. There's parts missing for that, so we've got to repair that so we've actually got wipers and indicators. And then there's the one I'm looking forward to, which is the power steering leak. We're also going to get into the fuel system, just flush the tank, put a new pump on it, and then just general stuff. Plugs, change on the oil. We'll start with the exhaust system. Let's get into it. Up on the hoist, and let's have a look underneath, but she's definitely power steering leak. The tranny is clean, but she's just a clean, dry country car. This is obviously surface rust, but floors are clean. That's the bush hackery. The only way that could be better is if that was a beer can. Just clean. We're going to get all this blacked. We're going to get this exhaust out. The tailpipes are rusted out here. It's got a limited slipper in it. So we'll get into it, we'll get the exhaust out, get it blacked. Let's stop talking and get into it. Blacking underneath it, I'm not using anything too elaborate or special. I'm just using an industrial etch primer that's able to go over surface rust and convert the rust, and then just a regular old underbody black. I've been out of the paint industry for quite a number of years now, probably not in touch with some of the better products that are out there now. If you've used anything, or if you know anything going straight over surface rust that you think's a good product, put it in the comments. I'd be interested to know. See, in the first Statesman episode, it only had 3 hubcaps on it. One of the wheels looked a bit sketchy, and it's not a Statesman wheel. It's got 3 14x6 factory Statesman wheels, and then I don't know what the other one is. It's a 14x5, and it's got a different funny lip. So I did manage to track down a hubcap. That wasn't actually that hard, but I haven't yet found a factory rim. I will get to that, but in the meantime, what I did is I bought some aftermarket steel rims and some 205/75 14s in a white wall. So we're going to put a little bit of cool on it. we've got all this section in, muffler in, but here's where I'm having the dramas. This curve doesn't seem to be tight enough. It doesn't seem to be tight enough. It's sort of too wide in its arc, and the tailpipe section's pointing. If I grab this tailpipe and put that, it's heading out way too low and out to the bloody left to hell. So what I'm going to do, and this might be a not how to, it might be a what not to, I'm going to try and get this tailpipe section up higher and also tilt it that way. So I've marked 2 tape lines. I'm going to cut along them both. I want that 100 mil higher. So I've made this one 90 mil and this one 110. So not only when I butt them back up will it be higher, but it'll actually tilt up as well. But as I said, this could go fabulously wrong. We'll see how we go. So I marked it, took it out, tacked it, and that's got the pipe up. If I grab the tailpipe, that just puts us tucked right up against the bumper, rather than where it was down like way down here. There's no way it was going to fit. So that'll put him up there nice and tight. I'll tack that guy on there. I sure seem to be making a lot of modifications to an off-the-shelf kit. I didn't expect it to be perfect, but stop whinging. Let's get into it. We'll move on from the exhaust now. It's all buttoned up, but that did take a bit more effort than I expected. A kit that was specifically ordered for a WB Statesman, and I kept it single 2.5 just to keep it simple, you know, simple one pipe over the diff and that sort of thing. I sure did seem to be doing a lot of cutting and welding. I'm not into bagging products, but I know when that was pressed up, and that was Friday afternoon at 4:45. But anyway, I'm going to move on to draining the fuel tank. If you saw in the first Statesman video, we diluted what was in there. There wasn't a hell of a lot in there because I just wanted to get it running and see if it actually had oil pressure and the like. So now we know it's got oil pressure. It's actually got really good oil pressure, and we will change that oil again later on once I warm the motor up. But I've got new plugs because it did actually foul a set of plugs from driving in and out of the shed. We'll also do a fuel pump, but I'll get into why into that shortly. Let's start draining this fuel out. What I'm going to do to siphon this fuel is I'm literally just going to pull the pipe off the bottom of the fuel pump there, makeshift line into that drum, and then just keep changing that drum and get as much out as I can. I'm not 100% sure, as I said, whether it's the bad fuel or whether the plugs are shot, so I'm going to do both, because now it's not just a matter of getting it running and driving. Now I actually want to get out on the road, and I don't want bad fuel to foul plugs 50 k's down the track. So we'll get it into that, and the way to tell if it's still got decent octane is when you're up here, make sure you get plenty of it down your arm, because when it gets in your armpit and stings, depending on how much it stings, that's if it's good or bad. So it might be plan B on this one. I've got the line there. I've had a couple of sucks on that the old school way, and gonna have to go and have a beer and get that nasty taste out of my mouth, because nothing really beneficial happened. So and yes, I have got the line before the pump. I'm not trying to siphon it through the pump. It's the line straight to the tank. There isn't a lift pump or anything in the tank with these. It's just a straight line, but I'm wondering if that filter in the tank is a little blocked. So I'll whack a pump on the end of that, see if I can pump it out, and if that's not the case, I might even drop that tank and see what's really going on. And I'm still trying to wash the taste out. I didn't even get any fuel, it was just vapor. I'm still trying to wash the taste out. Anyway, we'll get into it. So I've got a little pump, connected that up to the line and run into the drum. Now, this is an old motorised golf buggy I was fixing for a friend, but it's going to come in handy. This way you can get your battery really close to your fuel drum. You need that because you have to have a little excitement in your life. flick the switch on that and see if we get any fuel running into there. So I started with the pump and now she's siphoning pretty good. So there's no issue with the tank or the in-tank filter or anything like that. I'll get 20 litres in that guy, 20 litres in that guy. That should nearly clear him out, but we'll see where we're at. And then we'll move on to the fuel pump. While that's siphoning, I'll go through exactly why I'm going to change this fuel pump when it actually still works. So while we're siphoning that fuel out, I'll show you how I'm going to replace the pump. This is a non-serviceable pump. It's a sealed unit, and this is the 308 pump. This section here runs up to the camshaft, and there's an eccentric on the camshaft, which basically means a circle that's offset, so it has a pumping motion at the lever. But this is a serviceable pump. If you see, it's got bolts all around it, and that's actually off the 202. What's inside the pump is a diaphragm. So that lever is pumping that diaphragm up and down. And there's valves in the bottom of the pump, which are one-way valves. The problem with those are, if they've been sitting a long time, is the rubber will perforate and crack. I pulled that off the 202 as a precaution. Why I say a precaution, what happens is when that cracks, when that perforates and cracks, it might only be a slightest split, but what it's doing is it then allows fuel to the body of the pump. Well, guess where that goes? Out that dirty old hole there and straight into your crankcase. The way to tell if that's happening is if, number one, your oil level is rising, and if it is, that's a lot of fuel. That's diluting your oil. Or number two, if your oil stinks of fuel, and I can't tell with this one because the stale fuel stink up the front is quite bad, so I can't tell if the oil stinks or whether I'm smelling from elsewhere. So I'm going to do it as a precaution, and then we should be pretty much trouble-free cruising. The fuel pump is not a difficult job to do. With a bolt at the top and a nut and a stud at the bottom. Down there, if you see past the power steering pulley, there's the pump there. There he is there. Alright, we'll knock him out. I won't change the plugs and the oil yet because there's still going to be a little bit of fuel in the bowl and all that sort of thing. Just in case it was the fuel that was fouling the plugs, I'll start it even if it's going to run on a mist till it gets fresh fuel. Then I'll do the plugs. Then once he's warm, then I'll drop the oil. When we first got this thing running, it took us a little bit, but we did get it running pretty good. But what I was finding is if I went back to something else and she sat for a day or two, she was a little bit hard to start. So you saw yesterday, we drained that fuel, I swapped out the fuel pump. So the plan was fire it up with what's in the carburetor, allow the fresh fuel to get through the pump up to the carburetor, then warm it up, change the plugs, change the oil, done. But she may have just told me this morning there's an underlying issue that may have been causing the little bit hard to start after sitting for a couple of days. So as I say, the theory was drain that stinking fuel out of the tank, new fuel pump on it, so you've got fresh fuel that'll come to here, and then it should fire on what's in the bowl and allow the pump time to suck the fresh fuel up. That was the theory. But when I went to wind on it, it's now been sitting 7 days, and the reason being, we're just finishing up on the HQ, so it's been sitting 7 days now, and when I went to wind it over, nothing. It wound and wound and wound as if it had no fuel whatsoever. Now that makes sense from the pump back still sucking it up, but it still should have old fuel in the bowl. We didn't drain that and it should have retained fuel, but guess what? There is no fuel in the bowl whatsoever. The way to tell is you cast your eyes down there, open that plate, and there should be 2 streams of fuel down there. You can actually hear it pumping air. The accelerator pump will inject a small amount of fuel into the throat of the carburetor to allow it to start, but there's nothing at all in there, which means that bowl is leaking fuel south into the manifold. That would explain, number one, why it won't start now, because there's no fuel to start it, and number two, why it was fouling that plug and a little bit hard to start. I would say when it sat for 2 days, it had leaked down enough to pool fuel in the manifold. The poor quality fuel and the excess of fuel has fouled the plug. I'm no expert with anything, but I'm really not an expert on these Rochesters. As I said in the first video when we got the Statesman, the first thing you used to do back in the day was pull these Rochesters off and the stock manifold, chuck them in the bin, and put an Edelbrock manifold and a Holly carb on it. But these days, not so much. We're going to try and save on this one, so I'm just going to wing it. We're going to pull the carby off, fill the bowl full of fuel, and just see where it's coming out underneath the carby. Let's stop talking and get into it. So like I said, I'm winging it on this thing, but what I'm going to do is, this has 1 million vacuum lines all around this, and it literally has 1 million of them. They're everywhere. Label them, and I don't mean this runs to the vacuum advance. I don't mean put vacuum advance. We know it's a vacuum advance. It's still attached to the vacuum advance. Right where it goes on the carburetor, passenger side bottom of bowl. That's easy. Top of carb bowl, easy. That's just so you're not chucking them back in the wrong spot when you're going back together, confusing them, putting them in the wrong spot and creating other issues for you. You can wing it, but don't make it harder than it has to be. Keep it simple. So got him off, but I'm having flashbacks to when I was 19. I got him up off the bench. We just jammed a couple of screwdrivers up through him. Yeah. And I don't know if you can see under there that well, but we'll try it. We'll fill the bowl. See if that's leaking anywhere. It might take a while because, I mean, this took days to bleed down, so I'll get into something else while I see if that bleeds down. So it's definitely leaking. It's coming through the throttle plate, so I'm going to have to pull this throttle plate off and see what's in the bottom of the bowl that's allowing that to leak into that throttle plate. I was saying before about you'd be able to see if there was fuel in the bowl, and you'll be able to see it better here. So if I open that and with my thumb I'll open the throttle, and you'll see just here there'll be 2 streams of fuel, one this side and one the other side. That's how you tell if there's anything in the bowl and if the accelerator pump, see down there, that's what should have been happening, but because the bowl was empty there was nothing. So we'll get that throttle plate off and just see what's going on. I've got everything cleaned up, the base plate, the lid. The only thing I can find, if you see, this is actually upside down. Carburetor obviously goes that way. Here, I'd say when they drill these passages here and back that way, and then they plug, looks like they plug these drill holes because they drill back that way and then plug. That looks to me, if I get this screwdriver and show you, that there Looks like a corroded hole. I'm going to get a little bit of JB weld or something on them, then start putting them back together. It's all back together and cleaned up, but I can tell you that was painful and I was winging it. Never pulled one of them apart before, but I reckon I'm on the right track with those two little passages that have been drilled from factory and then plugged. The ends of them looked really corroded to the point where one actually looked like it had a fine pinhole in it, but when you filled the bowl it wasn't leaking fast enough to go, well, there's a drip. So the leak was so slow. But have a look at this, I reckon I'm on the right track. Check this out. We'll have a look down inside this manifold. Can you see how those ones are quite dirty? But look at that one. It's quite clean. Almost as if that mark there is from dripping fuel pooling there, because that one's not quite as clean. We'll soon see. I'll get the carburetor back on and see if it fires. Kind of back where I was this morning now. Carburetor's back on. We can fire it up, warm up that oil, drop the oil, change out on the plugs, and then hopefully that's the fuel system sorted. For the first time going through a Rochester, I did fumble through it a little bit, and there's definitely little tricks that you'd need to learn. I do love my Hollies and how simple they are, but you've got to have a crack at some different shit or you're just going to sit in that one comfort zone. And that's why I'm doing this one coming up. We're going to get right outside my comfort zone and go EFI. That's coming up. It's a 600 horse kit. I haven't decided what car it's going to go on. Maybe Mucus, maybe the FB Rat Rod, I don't know. Anyway, let's get back to this one. For a bit of a drive, get this oil warmed up, and then we'll get the oil out of her and plugs in her and see how much further we can get. Check this out. Don't worry about the charge light, it comes good. Look at the oil pressure. Gotta wake it up. So I got a hoist, but ended up on my back again. It's because I usually use that tray on top of my transmission jack. But the EH's Power Glide they're still on the transmission jack, so I couldn't be bothered taking the power glide off the jack. I'm just going to do it on down here. Alright, oil's done, fuel system's buttoned up. Let's get these plugs in it. When you're fitting plugs, it's a bit like the hard line into the fuel pump or the hard line into the brake booster. Go in by hand first, make sure it's in there properly. Because if you just get it to sit in there, think, yep, that's in there, whack a ratchet on it and start ratcheting it down. And if you cross thread it, you will find a whole new emotion that you did not know you had. It'll be a cross between extreme self-loathing, hatred and sorrow. Go in with your fingers first. So next little job on the Stato is address this whole thing. I can't get an aftermarket one in the right colour, and I want to get this rego'd soon, so I've bought, the only colours they make is brown and black. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap that one in, and in the meantime see if I can either chase up a second hand one of these or just get a second hand one in a different colour that's factory, so that it's using factory parts, and try and rebuild this one. We'll get this one in, get it running, get it driving, and then I'll chase up the bits for that. So first things first is remove the center cover. There's a nut in there, there's a screw at the back here. We're going to take that guy out. So covers off, 22mm nut in here, and back him off. If you don't have the expensive puller that goes into those threads there and pulls the steering wheel off, this is the way I do it. Normally there's a cross bit for the steering wheel and you get your knees in behind it, but we'll have a crack. So knees in behind it, put a little bit of pressure on the steering wheel, and then tap there with a hammer, but make sure you bring your nut out flush with the column shaft, because if you hit the edge of the thread on the column shaft, you'll make it impossible for that nut to come off. So bring him out flat so you're hitting on both the nut and the column shaft, and give it a tap. Three little taps and he's popped off, you can see it's, so you're just putting pressure with your knees behind the wheel and tapping on that shaft, and that's popped off. Just like that. So once the steering wheel's off, you've got this screw here, that's screwing in your post, and then you've got, for the indicator mechanism, you have 1, 2, 3. So one at the bottom there, one up here, and we'll pull that out. So you've undone that one, slide him back. Down underneath is a plug, unplug him. It's a long plug like this. Unplug that fella and just drag this guy out a little. Undo the 3 screws around that. You don't have to undo the plug for that guy, just hang him to the side. And then this fella, with a bit of working, should slide up through the column and out. So some of them, if they're fairly simple, that'll slide straight out, but if it's not going to come straight out, there's a bit much in this steering column. Undo the bottom of the dash here, and there'll be 3 bolts in this column, and that'll all drop down. I've removed the bottom panel, and these are the 3 bolts I'm talking about. 1, 2, 3, and that will allow the column to drop down. Okay, so you can drop down the column. You can now see where the wiring harness is, and you can thread it up and out like that, and then just do the same in reverse. If you're attacking something like this and you haven't done it before, don't be frightened to write down the steps as you take something off. Write it down, so then when it's going back together, you can just reverse the steps or reverse the order. So with a new wiper and indicator post in, we can start checking some electrics, see what works and what doesn't. A lot of people get put off when it comes to wiring, and I must admit it's not my favourite thing. But I've gone round this car and I pretty much had 3 of everything working. There was one of something not working in each corner. I haven't had to put a single bulb in this yet. It's just been connections. Sometimes the simplest way is unplug your connections, like here and here. Earth your test light to the battery, and then just whack your test light in, give it a good hard push in there, wriggle it round, and there's your power there. So we've got power at the plug, but we had no headlight, and I'll show you why. You can see in there's that chalky residue. That's all it'll be. It'll just be a contact between that plug, so the power's there at the plug but it's not getting through to the wiring going to the headlight. Here's what I generally do: go down and raid your other half's nail file and dingo container or whatever they've got, get a little piece of emery board, I guess you'd call that, and I've halved it to make it nice and thin. Then get your emery board down in that plug and just wiggle it around. And wouldn't you know it, the minute I said I hadn't put a bulb in anything, it's just connections. Nah, high beam, need a bulb. Tell you what, never a dull moment with the old Statesman. She's thrown a couple of tricks at me and she's just flicked me another curveball. I had all the air cleaner on, you know, buttoned all that up, that was all finished. Just brought her over to top up the water. So I just fitted, this guy finally turned up and I fitted that's a vacuum operated heater tap. Went to top him up with water, had him idling, and stopped dead. So a couple of pumps on the throttle, thought I'll kick her over again. Completely out of fuel, no fuel in that carburetor whatsoever. Now that cannot be related to the issue we had earlier, because it was running. The pump should be pumping fuel, filling that, wouldn't matter if it was still leaking. So something's going on between that pump and that carburetor. Took the fuel line off, there was fuel there. Took that front filter out, there was fuel there. Then at light bulb moment I realised what's going on. Yesterday when I was reusing gaskets, I used Permatex aviation shit, and it is great. It does seal up pretty much anything. But I would say I've had it on my fingers. I've been handling the needle and seat when I was putting it back in the bowl. I would say the float is just stuck in the up position from sitting overnight. So that's an easy fix though. You take this. So how do you fix a stuck float in a fuel bowl with a hammer? You didn't ask, but I'm going to show you anyway. All carburetors, and this is a Holly, have a fuel bowl somewhere. You've heard me say fuel bowl a million times through the video, but here's what it is. It's where the carburetor will actually store its fuel that it's going to need. In the Rochester, it's in the centre of the carburetor. When you saw we had it apart, you could see the section there, the hollow section there. It's in the centre of the carburetor, but a Holly has one at the front and one at the back. And at the top of the bowls, there is a needle and seat in each. And that allows the fuel in to the bowl. As the fuel level rises, it shuts off. This is a bowl that's been removed, and if you see in there, there's the float. So that's the bowl, and that's the float in the bowl. And if a Holly has a leak, you can see it's because it's external, it's out here. But we couldn't see that on the Rochester. Most times if a car's been parked for a long time, as it leaks down, the float will stick down. So when you try to start it, the float will stay open and actually flood the engine. But what's actually happened in the Rochester is I've used this amazing shit. Permatex aviation former gasket. Very, very good stuff, but it is sticky. And what's actually happened is when the bowl's risen, the needle and seat from my sticky old fingers putting it back together has actually stuck up. So it's stuck in the closed position. When it's in the closed position, no fuel can come in through the front of the carburetor, so it effectively just drained the bowl of all the fuel that it could use and then ran out of fuel. If it's just sitting there stuck, tapping it with a hammer allows the float to drop, you got fuel again. Simple as that. Or in the case of the other way where it's stuck open, works both ways, you can actually tap on it so that if it is stuck in there, it dislodges it and it will rise again, shutting the fuel off so you'll stop flooding. So we've got a fair bit done in the last couple of days with the carb issue repaired, full exhaust on it now, and I can tell you that sounds a lot better in person than it does in the footage. Tomorrow's the one that I've sort of been reluctant to start on. It's that power steering leak. When I had a lot of these HQ through to WB models back in the day, I always had the Povo models. As a kid you had no money, so you always had the poverty model. So believe it or not, I've never actually had a power steering H series Holden, HQ right through to obviously WB. So it'll be a new one. I'm learning on this Statesman. Never pulled a Rochester apart because I always threw them in the bin. Sorry about that, you resto guys that are now looking for good Rochesters. But for now, I've had enough. It's beer time. We'll get into that power steering in the morning and get that buttoned up, and I'm pretty sure that's the last thing before rego. So we'll have rego on this guy by the end of the week. Alright, see you in the morning. Looking at the steering box from the top here, he's pretty dry around the top, so the leak's definitely got to be coming from the bottom side around that pitman arm or something like that. So we'll get him in the air and see what we can find. So in a funny way, I was saving this to last, this power steering job, because I think it's going to be one of those jobs that's long and tedious. But what I can see is there's a seal. See that seal there? That's not really doing anything. It's like, it looks like there's another one there, unless somebody's got sketchy and tried to fix it by just jamming a couple of big O-rings up. So let's whip that nut off, drop that arm down, and take a look at that seal. See if it is the same one that I'm seeing in that kit. If it is, and that's all that is a shrunk seal and it's fallen out, if I can just pop that new seal in, mate, dead set, I'm sparking that fire bucket and cracking a can early. So same theory as I've given you before. Heat and WD, actually don't need WD on this one because it's smothered in power steering fluid, but heat the pitman arm and mark it. The reason we mark it is when we get that arm off, if you put it back on, one tooth clocked around, the steering alignment won't change, but your steering will be off center, and then you're popping the wheel off from whichever way you're taking this back apart. So just mark it so you can go back on the exact spline that it came off. And when you're marking it, just remember that you've just hit that with heat, and that arm is freaking hot. And I'm going to use one of these little contraptions. It's actually a balancer puller, and you wedge these little claws in behind the top of the steering arm so you're not damaging that seal up there by bashing it, and then just screw this guy in. That will push up on the steering box shaft and in turn pull that steering arm down. So here we go, I'll start winding on it. I'm nervous as shit. That's a lot of pressure on that. So I did crack him. That's dropped down now, but there was a lot of pressure on that. I was getting super nervous, almost standing behind the tyre for when it let go. And already you can see there's two seals there that have dropped down, not really doing anything. So, and that arm will drop down just like that. So then you've got enough clearance to get in there without having to undo that guy or any of them. I think there's a bit of bad news. I'm not hitting the cans early because I'm looking at that there thinking I don't think fluid should be getting to that seal. Circlip there, I think I'm going to pull that circlip out and see what else I can find. So I got the 2 seals in, took it for a drive to warm it up and see if we got the leak. Pulled back into the shed and there's oil everywhere. And I mean everywhere. But not power steering fluid. The Stato's decided to throw me another one. I'm starting to think this thing's just lazy. And I'm understanding why it's only got 107 Ks. It doesn't want to go back home to the road. You too good for your home car? She's decided to do a harmonic balancer seal, which is pretty common when they're sitting for a long time. They dry and they go brittle. You start to warm them up, the spinning motion of the balancer, and they disintegrate, and that's what this one's done. So when I stopped cracking the shits, gathered my shit up, and they're not that hard, so we'll just get into it. Radiator's now out, fans off, power steering belt is the next one to come off. I'll get the pulley off and then we'll go through getting this balancer off and replacing that seal. So if you're removing a balancer, there's a large bolt in the center of the balancer and a washer. Knock that out and take the washer and take that washer as well. Then there's a couple of different styles of tools you can use. It's a claw type remover, which goes around the outside of the balancer like that. Or there's a duck foot type remover like that. And that actually bolts into the balancer and then pushes on the center. So both tools work with a similar principle, screwing that center thread to pull the balancer. But the one thing to watch out for is that section there is going to push into the end of the crank there, but now you've got an exposed thread. So as you go to do it, put the bolt back in first without the washer, so you're not damaging the end of the thread, because if that pushes into the end of the crank and damages the thread in the end of that crank after you put the balancer back on, you'll end up sitting in that corner contemplating your whole existence. So there's the end of the crank there, and there's the bolt back in. So remove the bolt, and you can see there's the thread that we're trying not to damage. Because if you get that, go jamming it into there, you can see how that goes in and will actually damage that thread depending on what type of pulley you're using. Now you can get cups like that that are actually wider than the hole in the end of the crank, and so it won't sit on the thread. But the reason I used that guy instead of the old duck foot is on this balancer, the duck foot wasn't quite wide enough to get those holes in. It wasn't quite wide enough, so I couldn't get the old duck foot in there, so I used the claw. And just to make it a little easier for the puller, heat the balancer. You see that I did it with the old torch. But if you're going to reuse that balancer, don't use the torch. These balancers are 2-piece. There's an inner and an outer section, and they're bonded together. If you damage that bond, the balancer will fall apart. So if you're going to reuse the balancer, use something like a heat gun. But I'm replacing the balancer, so I didn't give a shit. No wonder it was leaking. It is just brittle. There's nothing rubber about that anymore. That's just from sitting, I would imagine. It's just hardened. God knows how long it's been sitting, this thing. So this is our new seal. That's what it should have looked like. And obviously a new balancer. So the seal's going to press into the timing cover and right around the back of the balancer like that. So we have to get that seal in that hole. Now if you've seen previous episodes, we've used the same principle of metal expands when it's hot and contracts when it's cold. So what I'm going to do, heat the timing case. If you're going to use the torch, be careful because there's a sump seal there. I'm going to use the heat gun on this one up here, and we're going to throw that guy in the freezer. So once you've chilled the seal down and you've heated the timing case, then get a big socket or something to go around the edge of that so you can tap it in. I'm just using an old piece of exhaust pipe. It fits right around the metal edge, and you can just tap on that rather than tapping on the edge of the seal. And if you've got one, use a dead blow hammer so the pressure's dispersed a bit better. So the seal's in. First things first with your new balancer, get a vernier and actually check that it is the right balancer for what you're doing. The reason you want to check, just in case you go through all these steps and you're trying to force him on there and then you find out it's 5 mils difference or something like that, it was never going to fit in the first place. Now we want to heat that guy, and remember, keeping the heat away from that bond, and cool down the crank. So here's what I normally do. Chuck your bolt back in for no reason other than to give a bag of ice something to hang on to, and go and have a couple of cold cans while you wait. Now if you got the balancer warm enough and the crank cold enough, that'll slide on. Once you've lined up the keyway, that'll slide on far enough that you can get your bolt, put him into the crank, and then whack a socket on it and just start doing him up. And essentially that will pull the balancer, that washer will sit against the balancer and pull that balancer into the correct position. Make sure you don't pinch the seal as you're going in, and don't use a rattle gun, use a ratchet so you can feel it go in. You'll see it pulling itself in. I just put a little bit of WD on that seal just so it doesn't grab the edge of that seal and tear it or anything stupid like that. And just keep winding him in. Balancer fitted. Let's put the rest of it back together. Just a quick one on balancers and why I'm replacing the one on this. If you look at that balancer, you can see that outer edge is protruding. And if you look at the front, you can see it's got a lip. That is the outer rim of the balancer is actually going forward. It's coming apart basically. And you can see that by that protruding seal at the back there. So that's why I decided to replace this balancer while I had it off. It is a good idea. The other thing that can become a drama with balancers, if you see there I've got the timing mark. If this bond deteriorates enough, you can actually rotate that outer ring. Now on your crankshaft there's a keyway, and a keyway is a little slot, and you'll see on the balancer, there it is there at the bottom. You'll see the keyway just there at the bottom. So that means the balancer is on the crank in a certain position, but if the outer rim rotates on that bond there, and this mark is now not in relation to the crank keyway, your timing will be out. You'd have to check the timing another way. That's a whole nother conversation we won't get into with this one, but just a couple of things on balancers. Right, it's all back together. Let's go for a drive. while we're siphoning, has fouled the plug. So, and then the phone rings. So as you go to do it, drop everything on the fucking floor. You just heated it up, fuckhead. The fuck did I put that other pump? And you'll see on the balancer. No, you won't, because I can't show you. It's fucking still hot too. How many times are you gonna do that? Stick around, we just bought a heap of new cars, stuff you haven't seen before, plus coming up soon the big blocky H is back, and the one I've been keen for, I'm starting on the Mucus HQ. Thanks for watching.